Will do.
Oh,
God.
hello, and welcome to episode 84 of the To Be Read podcast, where we talk about the books we love and the topics that interest us. I'm Patrick Stemp. With me, as always, is Michael Ronn. How are you, Michael?
Great, Patrick. How are you this week?
Good. And John L. Monk. How are you doing, John?
I am awesome.
So tonight we are going to talk about tense and point of view. And before we do that, we'll go through our weekly roundtable and talk what we've been reading over the past week, as John is making horrible noises over there.
Sorry about that.
So do you want to go first, John, since you're...
What am I reading this week? Yeah, I'm actually deep in the Rook, and I guess I can't really talk about my experiences of it because that's for I think that's for next week. Is what's the date?
A couple weeks from now, first week of February.
Yeah.
Yep.
First week of February. Yeah. Wow. I was getting ahead of myself. Okay. So anyway, I'll make a real quick statement though that I really am enjoying it. So, and I won't say anything else. That's what I'm reading right now. Short and sweet.
Okay. How about you, Michael?
Yeah, I'm also reading The Rook. I did finish a couple of things this week that I want to talk about, and I have made a big goal this year to have short stories and poetry be part of my regular production output. So I actually picked up a couple of issues of a magazine called New Myths. I don't know if you guys have heard of it, but they do science fiction and fantasy short stories and poetry. And conveniently enough, I was actually featured. One of my poems was featured in the December issue, so I hadn't gotten around to reading it until now. Thank you. And so I didn't read my poem just because I don't do that, but I read everyone else's, and their short stories are pretty eclectic, but I really like their poetry. And I read the December issue, and there's about, I think, maybe 10 people featured in the issue, and there were all kinds of different short stories. There was some fantasy, some science fiction, maybe a little bit of horror. There was some flash fiction in there that I really enjoyed. But yeah, it was definitely very interesting. There was a flash fiction piece in particular that I really liked, and it was by Gene McKinney, and it was about like two witches that I thought was pretty cool. It definitely had a different take on witches that I hadn't seen before. But what I really like about this magazine in particular is that they have like nonfiction essays. So if you guys have ever read like a literary magazine, every once in a while they'll have essays and things like that about topics. And one of the ones in this one that I liked was it talked about crying baby in the background. It talked about Heinlein Starship Troopers and its impact on the military.
Oh, cool.
Which I thought was pretty cool because I haven't read Starship Troopers, but I thought it was pretty cool.
It's awesome.
So yeah. So that's one I would recommend.
Okay.
Patrick, how about you?
Let's see. I finished reading A Cool Breeze on the Underground by Don Winslow, an author I've never heard of before, but I'm just kind of poking around. It looks like he's got a ton of books out. He has a new one out, shoot, I can't remember the name of it, but it looks like it's about the Mexican mafia. And but this one is a series, and it's featuring a character named Neil Carey. And I really, really enjoyed this book. It kind of pulled me in, not right away, but once it got going, it dragged me in. And it's about a guy, when he was a kid, he kind of got picked up and mentored by someone much wiser and older than him, and mentored in the ways of tracking people, finding them, doing all kinds of sort of covert type stuff. And it turns out that this guy works for a group they call the Family, which is essentially an old bank that realized that there's money, sort of financial benefit as well as other kinds of benefits in helping their clientele keep some things quiet, help them sort of keep stuff out of the press or get out of a jam, all that kind of stuff. So they help friends of the family. And anyway, he gets tasked in this book with tracking down the daughter of a senator who is running for vice president, or will be, and his daughter has kind of taken off, and she's done this before, and they need him to find her, clean her up because she's a drug addict and bring her back on a specific date, basically just to bring her back to town, so that she can be part of the family for some press opportunities and that kind of stuff. And of course things don't go as well as anybody wants them to, which makes it a good story. And I really enjoyed this. I think some people don't like how much backstory he gets into. He does it very well. He doesn't do a whole bunch of data dumping or history dumping at the beginning. You get to spend a little bit of time with the character, and then he really does spend quite a bit of time in the past talking about all the different things that he learned. It's really cool reading about the kind of the games they played to help him work on his memory, to track someone through the streets without them knowing that they're being tracked, to even be able to do that while you're in front of the person that you're following, which is a really interesting idea. And then he gets back to the story, and things take off from there. I really enjoyed the book. I think I'll be checking out some other books by this author. Maybe not anytime soon because my TBR list is pretty full, but he's on my list definitely as an author that I'm going to want to read more of.
What was the name of that again? That sounds interesting.
A Cool Breeze on the Underground.
Had you mentioned it before? Because it sounds really familiar.
I mentioned it that I was reading it.
Okay.
And it was one that totally not on my radar, but in listening to another podcast, the self-publishing podcast, it was one that Johnny B. Truant had mentioned that he was reading. That seemed to kind of take him by surprise as well. I don't know where his recommendation came from, but I'm glad I checked it out because I really enjoyed it. It was a good solid read. And I've also been working my way through Swag by Elmore Leonard. About 75% of the way through that, so I'll talk about that more. I'm sure I'll be done that easy in the next couple days, so we'll talk about it some more next week.
Awesome.
And also starting to work my way through The Rook as well.
Cool. This is a reread for you, right?
Yep. Yeah, it's been years since I read it. I had asked for a paper copy 2 Christmases ago, I think, and got one. And then it sat on my shelf. And one of the reasons I wanted a copy was because I wanted to reread it because the sequel was supposed to be coming out, and it never did. It pushed back and pushed back and pushed back, and kind of kept it on the shelf. I wanted to reread it, and now I'm hoping that it doesn't get pushed back again from its June release this year, and so I figured it'd be a good time to reread it now.
Cool.
And as a reread, I'm enjoying it. There's some stuff that I'd forgotten, and it's a fun book. That's my reading. Go ahead.
I wish I could say more about it, because
yeah.
Well, yeah, we'll do a deeper dive for sure when we. So hopefully you're taking notes while you're reading it, stuff that you don't like or do like or whatever. So we can move on to our topic for the week and talk about some point of view and tense. And I think, whose idea was this? I think it was yours, wasn't it, Michael?
I think it was John's.
Yes, it was mine, but I don't need credit.
No, but it just means we can put you on the burner and let you go first with your thoughts.
You first.
All right. Well, I guess the whole idea of this was that, I think that people feel really strongly sometimes about what tense they read in or what point of view they read in. I know that when I was growing up, whenever I came across a book that was in first-person point of view, I immediately rolled my eyes and chucked it across the library, or not exactly that, but because I just couldn't understand how anybody could remember every single word that they had said, every pause, every roll of the eyes, every tiny little thing. Actually, just a slight side note, not to plug my own stuff, but that's why I gave Dan Jenkins a perfect memory, because he writes in first person, because it was like, there was no other way that you could explain why a person would know that they sighed dramatically or something.
See, I don't read it like that when I'm reading first. Now, I
don't either.
I prefer third person, but when I'm reading first person, past tense, I'm not reading it as someone remembering what they did.
Yeah.
I read it as, they're experiencing the events as they happen, but we're reading about it after the fact, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it
Yeah,
does.
it's they're a narrator. They're almost like a medium. I don't think about that
Right.
either. It doesn't. That's never bothered me either. I've heard people say that though.
Well, that was childhood John L. Monk, not grown-up John L. Monk, who looks at it as sort of like it's a useful fiction. You just sort of squint your eyes and you just ignore that little fact, and you do think of him as a narrator if that's what it takes. You think of it as a window into the person's personality, and of course that's the big draw on first-person narratives, and so why they're now my favorite. Is that it's so easy for the author just to dive right into the protagonist's personality. I had a list of some favorite kind of first-person writers that I like. It's really short, 7 of them. There's probably more, but these are the ones that popped out, so that means something. Robert B. Parker's Spencer series, which was a big inspiration for both me and Jim Butcher, if you like Jim Butcher.
Mm-hmm.
I highly recommend those. Jim Butcher, Dresden. L.E. Modessa Jr., he writes in first person quite frequently, but he also pops over in the third once in a while. His greatest first person book, in my opinion, was Imager. And it's really weird about him is because he doesn't put a lot of personality into his first person narratives. Like everybody else, like Jim Butcher, Robert B. Parker, they all have this personality that just sort of seeps through. But L.E. Modessa Jr., he doesn't do that. He just sort of, he could probably just slip right over into third person, but he doesn't. And it's that little bit of extra personality that kind of sucks you in. There was a book called Motherless Brooklyn by Jonathan Latham. If you may ever heard of that, it's absolutely incredible. It's like a detective story / mob story, and it's also very funny. It's about a stuttering mobster / detective who has to kind of deal with the loss of their local, very minor mob boss named Frank, I believe. Vampire Lestat was mostly first person, so you get some first and third person mix-up going on in there, which is something I normally don't like, but I actually like it when it's done well, like here and also in The Rook. What else? Name of the Wind, Patrick Rothfuss, and Midshipman's Hope, David Feintook, which I talk about way too much. I know that. I'm going to yield back the balance of my time now. You guys can say a few things.
No, I read a couple of those on your list, and I guess I don't. I'm POV agnostic. I guess I don't necessarily care about the POV as long as the story's good, right? Because I think a lot of it also, with the first person, depends on genre too. So, like when I think mystery or detective, almost exclusively in the first person, right? Or like urban fantasy is another one that seems to be exclusively in the first person. Same thing with romance. Seems like a lot of romance is in first person nowadays, but I could be wrong on that. But just from what I've read, it seems like it.
For the most part, but I think hopefully they're doing it not necessarily because it's required of the genre. A lot of YA is first person, but I mean, in a genre where maybe most books are written in third person, if you wanted to write something that required sort of an untrustworthy point of view from the narrator, you kind of want to do it first person, right? Because otherwise it's the author that becomes untrustworthy.
Yeah.
So, I was thinking, Harry Potter, for example, is obviously told in third person. And I think, so I was thinking, could you tell that story in the first person? And I think you could, because you're in Harry's head, discovering things as he does, kind of like, but I wondered if you were to write that in first person, or if you were going to read it in first person, if it might be better if you were watching Harry through Hermione's eyes, or kind of like with Sherlock Holmes, where you don't want to be in Sherlock's head. You want to, you're watching everything through the perspective of Watson, right?
Right. Yeah. It's funny, like, the first person, there is one thing that kind of irks me a little bit about the first person, and I guess it's I see this in short stories and poetry a lot, and that's a first person narrator that narrates their own death in the present tense. Have you guys ever seen that?
How do you mean?
Okay. Like, okay, so he ran toward me. I'm getting stabbed. I feel the blade cringing or plunging into my bowels, and I slowly breathe my last breath. You know, like, okay, no.
But have you actually? I'm assuming you've actually read that.
I have. I've seen it in some short stories and poetry over the years, and it's just like, okay.
I mean, I guess then the story's
Yeah.
being told from the afterlife or something, then, right?
Well, yeah, but the story just ends. Like, it's not. You don't know if it's being told from the afterlife or if it's just a oversight on the author, you know. But yeah.
What if they're just dying and they're scrawling it out, and then they hit ... as they breathe out their last breath?
Or they crawled all the way to your house to tell you the story before they finally breathe their last breath, right?
Well, they're being stabbed while they're writing. They're multitasking.
Yeah, storytelling at its finest. Yeah,
that's a good one.
Yeah,
actually, that's a funny thing about first person is that's actually one of the weaknesses. I had some weaknesses in here. One of the weaknesses is that the protagonist survives, by the end of the story. You don't know whether they're paraplegic or not, but you know that they lived. What were we saying?
No, that's true. That's a good point. I don't see that necessarily as a weakness.
But I don't know that that's a given. I'm trying to think. I mean, you could have a first-person story where, the character dies and then the first-person pointed, like the view shifts, and I don't have any. I'm trying to think of an example where that happens towards the end of a book, and I'm sure it's pretty rare. But there is so the Newsflesh trilogy by Myra Grant, which I think she won a Hugo for book 1 or 2, and it's a great sort of zombie apocalypse series. And the first 2 books are told through the perspective of the first-person perspective of a female character. And then in the 3rd book, I got really thrown off because, or it was the 2nd or 3rd book, the perspective changes to her brother, which was a character I really didn't care for from her point of view. But as I got into the book, then you start to discover their motivations and maybe a little bit of why they act why he acted the way he did, and it really did work. Now I can't think of an example where that's happened in the middle of a book or towards the end, but certainly it's even odd in a series, I think. Mm-hmm. But she made it work in that case. So I think you're probably right. Like 99 times out of 100, you're right. If it's you know that they're going to survive, but these days, I mean, really, I think in whether it's 1st or 3rd, you know that the main characters are probably going to survive, right?
Yeah, I mean,
James Bond is not going to get trapped in the.
A standalone novel, you might be wrong, but any kind of series, you would be right.
Yeah, and for a main character to die in a standalone novel, you're probably heading more into the realms of like literature than genre fiction. Maybe I think it's probably pretty rare because I think also
and all that,
and writers probably also if people like this, I'm going to want to write a 2nd and a 3rd and a 4th book. So I don't want to kill off the main character just yet.
Sure.
Yeah, I think the biggest weakness with first person to me as a writer is I feel like sometimes there are a lot of characters that I want to explore, but I'm tying myself to that character for the whole novel. I mean, I guess there's multiple POV first person narratives out there, but for me, I don't know, if it's first person, I kind of like to be in the head of that one person rather than in the heads of multiple people.
Yeah, me too.
I like good old kind of, call it boring if you want, but good old sensible 3rd person, past tense, 2, maybe 3 points of view throughout the story tops. I don't like to bounce around in a whole lot of heads. That's just the, and then you're not even thinking about it, right?
Right.
But honestly, a lot of the time I don't know that I think about hopefully tense. This should all really not matter, right? It's the kind of thing that you shouldn't even notice. If it's first person, you probably, after the first couple pages, maybe you shouldn't even really realize that, because you're just reading the story and enjoying it. And a lot of books, honestly, thinking back on them, I wouldn't be able to remember if a book was in first or third person, except for, so a few specific examples.
Yeah, it's all about the story. It doesn't matter how it gets told. It just matters what you remember.
Yep, like in thinking back on Kick and Opera House and all that, I don't specifically recall them being in first or third person.
Really?
I just remember the story. Yep.
Huh. Okay. Well, I mean, you could argue that let's just take Kick out of it because it's too self-serving, but Book X, you could remember that you loved Book X because of the characterization, but not remember why, and it was because it was in first person, or deep perspective third person, which is a sort of a trendy, somewhat newish kind of way of doing third person narrative where you just get really, really close to the character, so much so that other people become mom and dad rather than his mom and his dad. Orson Scott Card talked about that when I did that little class with him. He talked a lot about deep perspective third person. He talked about how third person narrative was the natural storytelling kind of point of view and tense of the English language, and he gave a lot of examples about why he felt the reason was why it was. And he's Orson Scott Card, and it was just nice to see how his opinion and not necessarily fact was sort of out there. And he talked a little bit about present tense, and he said that present tense was a product of English department's infatuations with French literature, because he said that French literature is always in present tense, and there is this need to kind of like be like them. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but it was an interesting perspective,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I prefer that close. I like the shoulder on the camera. Or sorry, the camera on the shoulder. On maybe one character, you're following them around. You're inside their head pretty much through the whole story, but not I did this, I did that.
Right. Or I do this and I do that, and I walk over to this refrigerator and pour soda.
Yeah, I find it jarring. Here's the thing. So I find it jarring when I read present tense, and it lasts for about 5 or 6 pages, and then it turns invisible, much like Patrick saying he doesn't, for some reason, remembering how my dumb book went. But I do find it jarring in the beginning, like, whoa, wait a minute, you're doing it now? Because I'm like here, and I don't see you, and I will also say, kind of in reference to what you said, Michael, earlier, that you don't think that necessarily some authors believe that you have to be one tense and perspective for a type of genre or not. You said something to that effect, and it triggered memory. There's a very popular indie author, romance author. She writes dark romance, which is sort of like way opposite of sweet romance. It's like tear your bodice off, throw you down, whatever kind of stuff. And she said that she has to write. It's a must with dark romance that you have to write in the present tense, first person, to get that immediacy and that readers expect it. It's like right up there with weddings at the end of happy, sweet romance almost. I don't know if she's right, but she makes it.
I can see where she's coming from on that. With romance, I can see how that in erotica too. I could see how that play-by-play sort of immediacy might work better.
Well, I think the same thing would work. I mean, and you did say dark, so this may be the same kind of reason too. Is for horror, first person, it's happening to me. Present tense, it's happening right now. There'd be a lot more sort of tension there. Kind of like you said, where if it's past tense, they survived it, right? For the most part. So the same kind of immediacy for if you wanted to do like a really kind of scary horror novel, put them in the here and now.
Yeah. Well, that's I think that's actually the point of a lot of the risk of sounding controversial, because I'll say right now I write in first person because it's a crutch. It's an easy way for me to get the reader to identify with the main character. It's my crutch. But I think that perhaps certain people like whoever, what's her name, Collins, that wrote Hunger Games.
Suzanne Collins.
Yeah, Suzanne Collins. Perhaps, they were thinking, all right, the book is about 70% interesting right now. I can get another 10% if I make it in present tense, and I can get yet another 10% if I make it in first person. Just to sort of ramp it up to kind of get where they want to be. I personally think that she could have written it in first person past tense and not jarred the reader for 5 pages before it became invisible, but that's just me. It seems to me like you don't gain anything else from that.
So can you think of any books that have been written in second point of view, future tense?
You will do this.
I was thinking about that earlier, though. I thought it'd be an interesting exercise, and the only way I could think, and I can't think of any books that have been written like that, but the only way I could think of that you could do that would be if the story was being told from the perspective of somebody who was being told their future, basically by like a psychic or whatever. Mm-hmm. You will do this, you will do that, and throughout the story, the character would have to ask some questions like, well, can't I do that? It would be very strange, but it was the only way I could think of that you could pull that off would be to have a fortune teller, or a palmist kind of, and with very specific details like, well, I'm reading your palm. You will walk into the room, and inside that room will be a man. He's going to pull a gun, and I don't know if you could get away with that in a novel. Maybe a short story is kind of, like I said, like an exercise.
Yeah, I actually have read something like that, ironically enough, and it was narrative nonfiction, and God, I remember the name of this story. I think it was Ryan Van Meter. It was a story. I forget the name of the story, but it was basically a narrative nonfiction about the narrator telling the reader what's going to happen when you come out of the closet as a gay man, and it talks. He says you're going to go and you're going to tell your parents and they're going to throw you out of the house, but it was powerful. It was evocative. So if I'm correct, I think that was in the second person future tense.
And actually, again, we'll talk about this book more later.
But that was very short.
There's a little bit of that in the Rook.
Yeah, there is.
In the letters that she has written to herself, talking to herself in the future. There's kind of a little taste of that. So that's another thing. Like you said, that was narrative nonfiction, but you could also do it as like a series of letters that was written to somebody. But again, probably telling the future, right?
Yeah. Well, that kind of leads us.
I was gonna, again, I guess when you start thinking about it, you get more ideas. Like it could be. Again, I don't know how you'd pull it off. It could be somebody who's being forced to do something by, someone who's holding their family hostage or something. Like, you will input the security code, right? They're following a very specific set of demands. You will input the security code. You will walk into the building. You will pull out the gun and shoot the security guard. I don't know.
And dance on his body.
It would be interesting. It'd be interesting to play with for sure.
Yeah, that's interesting stuff.
But there's also a reason that we can't think of 20. Examples of where people have used second person.
Well, it's because it gets old really fast. You can only get away with it for a couple of pages before it just becomes...
Right. Is it a gimmick or is it a story? Is it necessary to the story, right?
Well, I was going to bring up second person and just get your guys' opinions on it. Aside from Choose Your Own Adventures, right, which is a
menu, maybe.
Basically put second person on the map. Have you guys read anything in second person?
Just like menus and cookbooks, take 2 eggs and, add it to the cake stuff. We call it batter at my house. But
yeah, I can't think of any examples of second person, like I said.
Yeah, I almost see it exclusively with interactive fiction. And it's kind of one of the problems I have with it, because if there's any point of view, like, okay, so you've got the first person where you're in that person's head, and you've got the third person, for the most part, unless it's omniscient, which we haven't really talked about, but where the camera's on their shoulder with the deep point of view. But with the second person, there's no person really; it's you. So,
And sorry to it's on my shelf on the other side of the room, but now that I think of it, I'm pretty sure Neil Patrick Harris's Choose Your Own Autobiography is in second person, because he wrote, and this is a book I've had on my shelf for a while, and I've only read a little bit of it, is he's telling his life story, but as though you are him. And so, again, it's Choose Your Own Adventure, so that's probably explains why he did it that way, but it's like, so you've just finished filming, Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog. Do you want to audition for a role in what was that TV show he was on, or would you like to do something else first? And it's, so that's another way to do second person in an autobiography, which is really strange, but it works.
Yeah, and that's derived from the Choose Your Own Adventures.
Right.
So, yeah, I it's funny because when I hear people talk about Choose Your Own Adventures, I kind of hear something really common, and that's
you've either got a ghost or somebody just came in the room behind you.
That's my daughter. She's running around. Yeah. But anyway, now she gets left. So anyway, yeah, it's interesting because a lot of people will complain about second person and they'll say, I don't like the second person because I don't see myself doing that. Like, why am I going to punch that security guard in the face? Right? I wouldn't do that. I'd say, how are you doing first, or something like that. And like I think there's just not that. It's unless it's a really interesting premise, it's really hard to pull the reader in and make them believe that they're there. I feel like the first and the third person, it's much easier to do that with sensory details, right? With the five senses, than it is to just slap the reader in the character shoes and let them fend for themselves.
I bet you could do it with comedy. Like you could say like, you're looking at me with big brown eyes and that puppy dog face, and I'm not buying it. And kind of get into it and say, oh, look at you picking up another drink. Have another, why don't you? And you're constantly just, what you're doing is you're showcasing the narrator's sort of personality. In this case, maybe a chauvinistic kind of personality with someone who's been on the receiving end of a blowhard for in the past, maybe in other words, they don't think it's really them, but they get it, or something like that. I think it might work in comedy.
That almost seems to me like it would come off as first person, and that the narrator is speaking to someone, and speaking to the reader, as you're saying. But it sounds like it sounds like in a roundabout way it would
it's
come
like a mix
off
between the two.
It would come off as potentially being like first person, and that they were talking to somebody else in the room that we never get to meet.
Yeah, it's like 1.5.
Kind of, yeah.
You get the benefits of the first person, but then you also feel like you're talking to the second person. You're talking, it's like you're breaking the fourth wall.
Well, I was trying to imagine what fourth person might sound like, but I can't.
It would be like this.
I can't wrap
by
my head
computers.
around it.
You see him walk in the room, and then
That's
you
second
see
person.
him pick up the knife.
Yeah. Have you guys ever read anything in the second person plural?
They?
What?
Or the first person plural. Like, we were doing this or we were doing that. I've read a couple of short stories and they were kind of creepy.
But because I was going to say, that would read to me like somebody with multiple personality disorder or something.
Well, the one I'm thinking of, and I don't necessarily know if this was. I'm thinking of Our Town. Have you guys ever seen that play?
No.
It's a play. I can't remember who wrote it. It's some famous playwright, but the story is narrated by the town, and they're talking about these characters in the town, and so it's almost like it's a collective consciousness that's actually telling the story.
Well, I was going to say, like, you could pull in a science fiction setting. You could pull that off if it was a hive mind.
Yeah.
Where everything is, like the Borg. If you were going to write like Star Trek fan fiction or something, I'm sure the Borg think in that way. We do this, we do that.
Right.
So there's lots of really interesting ways to play around with this stuff.
Yeah.
But it's all experimental, and I think the author definitely takes a chance, right, in losing a reader in the first paragraph, let alone the first page or two, right? Where they just don't want to make the effort.
Yeah.
Because third person, past tense, is just so much more natural, and yeah, they'll just pick up the next book on the bookshelf and see if if it reads easier.
I remember looking at a K-Boards post about a year ago with a lot of replies and a lot of views, and it was something to the effect of, what do you think of first person, right? And then like all these very brave authors started responding about how they hated it and how they don't read anything of it, and if they see it's first person, they just shut the book. And then they started, like, maybe some of them were like deriding, like, I don't like it when he says, and now I was in trouble. Well, it's not now, because now I'm reading the book, and they were sort of nitpicking, kind of like my younger John L. Monk used to do. So it was just funny how visceral the reaction was. And I have to wonder, as an author who loves to write it and to read it, like how many people pick up the book and go, oh, God, first person, and they shut it immediately,
I think I have in the past, and probably through reading more YA over the years, I've come to enjoy it a little bit more. So it's not my preferred. It's not. I don't. It's I prefer the third person, but I don't close a book in disgust when I find out that it's in first person.
Yeah, I wouldn't close a book just because it's in the first person. The reason I usually close it is because the voice just doesn't feel like it's not interesting, or it just feels like everything else I've read.
Yeah, I'm more likely to close a book if in the third paragraph the character in first person looks in the mirror at their blonde hair and their blue eyes, and
they run a hand through it.
Yeah. So I think it's more storytelling that's going to pull me out than tense.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah.
So we're past a half hour, so we should start wrapping things up. Any last minute thoughts on tense or point of view?
No, other than like I'm inspired to write some more short stories now with
Do some experimenting.
Yeah, we'll see what happens. And there has to be a fourth person. I just wonder what that is. I'm gonna look that up.
Probably has something to do with time travel, or I don't know.
Yeah.
That's another way you could get into future tense as well, of course, is to write some Doctor Who fan fiction or something and talk about what's going to happen. So let me see here. Next week we have a guest, Stephen Campbell. Not to put you on the spot, John, but can you tell us a little bit about him?
Sure. He's I know him as a podcaster. He podcasts. He runs the podcast The Author Biz, which is really good. I've heard Christine Catherine Rush on there. I've heard Russell Blake, lots of other authors, Mark Dawson, that kind of thing. He also has a purely for readers podcast called Crime Fiction FM, and he's amazing. He does several podcasts a week, or he was for a while, of Crime Fiction FM. And get this, when he has the authors on, he's read their books. He's read all the books of all the people he does it. And he does multiple podcasts, at least in the past, a week. This guy's crazy. I don't understand how he can do it. He's also a really good podcaster. He's got a great voice. He's very professional, gift of gab, funny. You look forward to listening to him again. So I think he's going to be great on the show next week.
Okay.
Yeah.
So looking forward to that. And in the meantime, we will say goodbye to you for now until next Tuesday. Have a great week reading, and we'll talk to you soon.
See you next week, guys.
See you.